My little girl was crying, "Daddy, Daddy." When I woke up, the whole house was in smoke.
In 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed for murdering his kids by arson. Later, the evidence was scientifically proven to be invalid. Did Texas execute an innocent man? Let's go back to December 23rd, 1991. This is Liam. Welcome to my channel. Let's go back to December 23rd, 1991. Corsicana, Texas, a small working-class town about an hour south of Dallas. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where people decorate their homes with Christmas lights and look forward to the holidays. But on December 23rd, 1991, the holiday spirit was shattered by a tragedy that no one could have imagined. At 11:50 a.m., a neighbor saw thick black smoke rising from the small one-story home of Cameron Todd Willingham and his wife, Stacy Kuykendall. Within minutes, flames engulfed the house. Inside, 3 little girls, 2-year-old Amber and 1-year-old twins, Carmen and Cameron, were trapped as the fire spread. Their father, Cameron Todd Willingham, was home asleep when the fire started. According to him, he woke up to the sound of his daughter, Amber, calling for him. Smoke was already filling the room. The heat was unbearable. He claimed he frantically searched for his children, but the fire was too intense. With the flames closing in, he stumbled out the front door, barely escaping with his life. Neighbors Diane and Brandeis Barbie were among the first to arrive. They saw Willingham standing outside, yelling for someone to call 911. But what struck them as strange was what he did next. He moved his car away from the burning house before making any attempt to go back inside. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was already collapsing. The flames had devoured nearly everything. The fire crew fought desperately to contain the blaze, but it was too late. Inside, the remains of Amber, Carmen, and Cameron were found in what used to be their bedrooms. They had no chance to escape. The children's mother, Stacy Kuykendall, was not home at the time. She had gone Christmas shopping at a thrift store to buy presents for her daughters. She returned to find the house reduced to charred rubble, her children gone, her home destroyed. In the aftermath, Willingham was taken to the hospital for treatment. He had minor burns on his arms and shoulders, singed hair, and smoke stains on his face. But something felt off to investigators.
It was more like he was bragging about it than, being remorseful.
Willingham said he heard the oldest one calling Daddy and went into the bedroom and crawled around on the floor because the smoke was so thick and stuff, looking for the babies, but he was unable to find them.
His injuries weren't consistent with someone who had fought through flames to try and save his children. At first, authorities believed this was just a horrific accident, a Christmas tragedy that left a father devastated. But as they started digging into the details, a new question emerged. Was Cameron Todd Willingham a grieving father, or was he a murderer? Who was Cameron Todd Willingham? Before the fire that changed everything, Cameron Todd Willingham was just another guy in Corsicana, Texas. Born on January 9, 1968, he grew up in a working-class family, living a life that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. But to those who knew him, Willingham was a complicated man, one who inspired very different opinions depending on who you asked. To some, he was a hot-headed troublemaker, a man with a history of run-ins with the law. He had been arrested several times for petty crimes, theft, and burglary, but nothing that suggested he was violent, at least not towards strangers. In his personal life, that was another story. Willingham was a fan of Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin, and his house was covered in posters of skulls, flames, and demons, imagery that would later be used against him in court. But ask his probation officer, Polly Gooden, and she would tell you a different story. She described Willingham as one of her favorite kids, someone who wasn't violent, just young and reckless. Phoebe Bridges, a former judge, said she had dealt with Willingham for minor offenses before but never saw him as dangerous. Then there was Stacy Kuykendall, his wife and the mother of his children. Their relationship was rocky, to say the least. Stacy would later tell authorities that Willingham had been abusive toward her, especially when he was drinking. She claimed he had hit her even while she was pregnant, and that he was controlling and explosive, but Despite all that, there was one thing no one had ever accused him of before: hurting his children. By all accounts, Amber, Carmen, and Cameron adored their father, and there were no reports of child abuse before the fire. Even Stacy herself insisted that, no matter what their relationship was like, Willingham had never harmed the kids. So when investigators started suggesting that he had set the fire on purpose, people who knew him were divided. Was Cameron Todd Willingham just a reckless, hot-tempered husband with a history of bad decisions? Or was he a cold-blooded killer who murdered his own children? The way the world sees you isn't always the way you see yourself. Your image is shaped by the people around you, their perceptions, their biases, their judgments. And sometimes those impressions become more powerful than the truth. When everything is on the line, it won't matter who you believe you are. What will matter is how others have already decided to see you. For Willingham, that image was formed long before he ever stepped foot in a courtroom. As the case against him grew, his town, and eventually the nation, would be forced to decide. And for Willingham, the battle for his life was only just beginning. The investigation.
But we could see where there was burns in the hallway, and we can't figure out how he got out without burning his feet.
The smell of burnt wood and ash still lingered in the air as investigators combed through the wreckage of the Willingham home. The fire had consumed nearly everything, leaving behind only blackened beams, piles of rubble, and the skeletal remains of furniture. But in the midst of the destruction, something stood out. The patterns left by the flames didn't look random. To the trained eye of the fire investigators, this wasn't just an accidental blaze. This was a crime scene. The lead investigator, Deputy Fire Marshal Manuel Vasquez, walked carefully through the ruins, taking note of how the fire had spread. To him, the evidence was obvious. Investigators claimed that distinct burn patterns indicated the use of an accelerant, leading them to conclude it was arson. He believed these marks showed that someone had deliberately splashed fuel across the floor to intensify the flames. Investigators believed the fire had multiple points of origin, reinforcing their arson theory. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was found near the front door. The aluminum threshold had melted and warped, something investigators said could only happen in a fire that burned extremely hot, fueled by an accelerant. Tests later revealed the presence of a chemical compound similar to lighter fluid in that area. If that was true, it meant someone had deliberately doused the entrance with fuel, possibly to make sure the fire spread rapidly and trap those inside. For investigators, all of these signs pointed to one horrifying conclusion: this fire wasn't an accident, it was arson. As authorities examined the physical evidence, they also began analyzing Cameron Todd Willingham's behavior, and what they saw made them suspicious. The first thing that stood out was how little smoke Willingham had inhaled.
McCall came across the scanner. There was a house fire with possibly people trapped in it.
I remember my mom screaming, "Go back in, go try to get the babies."
And I grabbed him. I said, "Is there anybody in the house?" He said, "Yes, my twins are in that room right there." Well, I went in the front door and I went to the left, and that's as far as I could get. It was completely engulfed in fire.
I pulled up on the scene, got out, and immediately started stretching the fire line, and I made entry into the house, knocking the fire down as I went.
The first fire came out. He was cradling a small child in his arms. He began to drop to one knee, and as he began to drop to one knee, the little girl's arm just fell limp right at her side, just like a little rag doll.
In cases where people are trapped in a burning home, even those who escape are often left with severe smoke damage to their lungs and airways. Yet, Willingham had only minor burns on his arms and shoulders, singed hair, and smoke stains on his face. How, they wondered, could a man who claimed he had tried to rescue his daughters from an inferno walk away with so few injuries? Then, there was his behavior at the scene. But what they found odd was that, instead of immediately trying to go back inside for his children, he first moved his car away from the house. To them, it seemed like a strange priority for a man whose children were trapped inside a burning building. As more people gave statements, the accounts of Willingham's behavior became more conflicting. Some described him as frantic and devastated, screaming and throwing himself on the ground in anguish. Others claimed that, at certain moments, he seemed oddly calm, sitting on a nearby lawn without making any effort to run back inside. Almost as if he was reciting a script, the way he spoke struck them as rehearsed rather than spontaneous. As authorities pieced together these details, a disturbing thought formed in their minds. Was Cameron Todd Willingham truly a desperate father trying to save his children, or was he just putting on a show? If this was arson, the biggest question was why? What could drive a father to commit such an unimaginable act? Prosecutors and investigators began looking into Willingham's personal life, searching for anything that might explain why he would want to kill his children. They quickly built a theory. Willingham, they claimed, saw his children as a burden. By all accounts, Willingham had been struggling. He had no stable job and was barely scraping by financially. His relationship with Stacy Kuykendall, the children's mother, was rocky, marked by frequent fights and reports of domestic violence. Some of Stacy's family members even suggested that Willingham resented having children so young and had talked about wanting an escape from his responsibilities. Investigators believed that the fire was his way out. By eliminating his children, Willingham could be free of the financial and emotional burden of fatherhood. But there was one problem with this theory. There was no concrete evidence to support it. Despite their claims, there was no life insurance policy that Willingham stood to collect after his children's deaths. There were no reports of him abusing his kids or making direct threats against them, and even Stacy herself, though she acknowledged that Willingham could be violent toward her, insisted that he had never harmed their children. On January 8th, 1992, just 2 weeks after burying his daughters, Cameron Todd Willingham was arrested and charged with capital murder. At that moment, the world saw him not as a grieving father, but as a monster who had murdered his own children, and the town of Corsicana was ready to see him pay. The trial. By the time Cameron Todd Willingham's trial began in August 1992, the case against him seemed ironclad. To the prosecution, this was not a tragic accident. It was a brutal crime. A father who had deliberately set fire to his home, trapping his own children inside. The courtroom was packed, filled with locals who wanted one thing: justice for Amber, Carmen, and Cameron. From the very start, the prosecution painted Willingham as a cold-blooded killer, a man so ruthless that he could stand outside and watch as his own daughters burned. The lead investigator took the stand and confidently declared that the fire had been intentionally set. He pointed to the burn marks on the floor, explaining that they formed puddle-shaped patterns, a classic sign of a liquid accelerant being poured and ignited. The way the fire had spread, fast and hot, consuming the house in minutes, wasn't natural, he argued. To him, this wasn't a case of faulty wiring or an accident with a heater. Someone had started this fire on purpose, and according to the state, that someone was Cameron Todd Willingham. As the jurors listened, they were shown images of the burned remains of the Willingham home. Prosecutors described how investigators found traces of lighter fluid near the front door, a discovery they claimed was proof that Willingham had deliberately blocked an exit. The implication was chilling. He had made sure his daughters had nowhere to run. But the prosecution didn't stop at just physical evidence. They needed a motive. They needed the jury to believe that Willingham wasn't just guilty, but that he had wanted his children dead. They told the court that Willingham saw his daughters as a burden, an obstacle in his life. He had no job, no money, and was struggling to provide for his family. The prosecution hinted that, without the children, he would have more freedom, fewer responsibilities. They even suggested that he had a history of violence, reminding the jury that he had been physically abusive toward his wife, Stacy. If he could hit his wife, what was stopping him from harming his children? But the most damaging blow to Willingham's defense came from Johnny Webb, a jailhouse informant who claimed that Willingham had confessed to the crime. According to Webb, Willingham had admitted to setting the fire to cover up an injury or death of one of the children, though no physical evidence of abuse was ever found. Webb, who was facing his own legal troubles, claimed he was coming forward simply because it was the right thing to do. The jury had no reason to doubt him. Willingham's defense team, on the other hand, was painfully unprepared. They failed to challenge the fire science, even though they could have called their own experts to refute the state's findings. They didn't aggressively question Webb's credibility, nor did they highlight the lack of clear motive. The only argument they made was that Willingham had no reason to kill his children, but by then, the damage was done. As the trial went on, the prosecution began attacking Willingham's character, portraying him as a violent man with dark obsessions. They pointed to his tattoos of skulls and flames, arguing that they reflected a dangerous and disturbed mind. They even used his love for heavy metal music against him, claiming that his interest in bands like Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin was proof of his fascination with violence and death. Cameron Todd Willingham in 2004, just before his execution. Willingham refused to plead guilty in return for a life sentence and maintained his innocence until the day he was put to death. Accepting a guilty plea would have meant admitting to murdering his 3 daughters, something he vehemently denied. He believed that telling the truth was more important than saving his own life, even as the justice system refused to reconsider the flawed evidence against him.
That the person is guilty of the crime charged, and the chances of introducing reasonable doubt are slim to none in your professional opinion. Of course you'd rather have him accept a life sentence and save his life.
The final blow came from Dr. James Grigson, a psychiatrist known as Dr. Death, for his frequent testimonies in death penalty cases. He told the jury that Willingham was a sociopath, someone with no remorse, no capacity for change. He had never examined Willingham personally, but that didn't stop him from declaring that this man would kill again if given the chance. It took the jury less than 2 days to reach a verdict. Guilty of capital murder. When the judge handed down the death sentence, the courtroom was silent for just a moment before Stacy Kuykendall, the mother of the 3 girls, broke down in tears. For the people of Corsicana, it was a victory. Justice had been served. For Cameron Todd Willingham, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would end on a prison gurney. The appeals. From the moment Cameron Todd Willingham was sentenced to death, he insisted that he was innocent. He had sat in that courtroom, listening as fire investigators testified about puddle-shaped burns and accelerant residue, things he didn't understand, things he couldn't fight against. When the jury delivered their verdict, when the judge sentenced him to die by lethal injection, he had felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold. But this wasn't someone else's life. This was his. As the months passed behind bars, Willingham's world shrank to the cold walls of his prison cell. His only hope now lay in the appeals process, a long, complicated battle that would determine whether he would live or die. He placed his faith in the system, believing that if someone, anyone, took a real look at the evidence, they would see what he saw. There had never been a crime at all. But Texas had already made up its mind. Like every death row inmate, Willingham was entitled to an automatic appeal after his conviction. His attorneys filed motions arguing that his trial had been unfair, that his defense had failed him, that the fire investigation had relied on questionable science, but these appeals didn't introduce new evidence. They focused on legal technicalities. And the courts weren't interested in technicalities. His first appeal in 1995 was swiftly denied. The courts ruled that there was no reason to overturn his conviction. The forensic evidence had been accepted as fact during the trial. The witness testimony had gone unchallenged. The jury had made its decision, and the courts saw no reason to question it. With every denial, Willingham's frustration grew. How could they ignore the flaws in the case? How could they refuse to re-examine the so-called scientific evidence that had put him on death row? He was running out of options, and worse, he was running out of time. The life on death row. By the time Cameron Todd Willingham arrived on Texas's death row, he had already been condemned by the world outside. To the people of Corsicana, to the jury that convicted him, to the prison guards who escorted him through the steel gates of the Ellis unit, he wasn't a grieving father. He was a child killer. Death row wasn't like the rest of the prison system. It wasn't a place for rehabilitation, where inmates served their time and dreamed of release. Here, every man was waiting for the same thing, the day the state would decide it was time for them to die. Some spent years appealing their sentences, fighting for new trials. Others gave up entirely, resigning themselves to the fate that awaited them in the execution chamber. Willingham wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Inside the Polunsky unit, where Texas housed its death row inmates, time moved differently. The cells were small, just a concrete box with a steel door, a narrow bed, and a toilet. There was no TV, no contact with other prisoners, no human touch. Inmates spent 23 hours a day alone, locked inside their cells, staring at the same four walls. For 1 hour a day, they were allowed outside. But even then, there was no freedom. The outside was a cage, another concrete enclosure with metal fencing above, just enough for a glimpse of the sky. Willingham learned quickly that death row wasn't just a place. It was a slow, psychological death. In the beginning, he wrote letters constantly, pleading with his attorneys, his family, and anyone who would listen. He swore his innocence over and over again. He spent hours replaying the trial in his head, remembering the things he should have said, the arguments his lawyers failed to make. He could hear the executions happening just down the hall. Every few months, another inmate was led away. The sound of shackles dragging against the floor, the final footsteps toward the execution chamber, it was impossible to ignore. Some inmates went quietly, others went kicking and screaming. But they all left, one by one. And Cameron Todd Willingham knew that one day his name would be called too. In the first few years, Willingham's wife, Stacy Kuykendall, wrote to him often. Even though she had testified in his trial, even though their marriage had been toxic, there was still a bond between them, a bond formed by loss. But as the years passed, the letters became less frequent. Stacy had moved on with her life. She was trying to heal, trying to build a new future without the man who had once been her husband. And then, in 1993, just a year after his conviction, she filed for divorce. When Willingham received the papers in his cell, he barely reacted. Maybe he had expected it. Maybe a part of him had already known that he had lost her forever. Still, the reality of it hit hard. Stacy was gone. His children were gone. The life he had before the fire was over. From that point on, the only thing he had left was his fight for freedom. The changing faces of death row. The men who had arrived at death row around the same time as Willingham were disappearing, executed one by one. New faces arrived. Young men convicted of violent crimes, some of them unrepentant, others terrified of what lay ahead. Willingham saw it all, the way some inmates became ghosts before they ever made it to the execution chamber. Some stopped eating, some stopped talking, and some turned to religion, desperately seeking redemption before their final moments. But Willingham wasn't like them. He never admitted guilt. He never asked for forgiveness. He refused to confess to a crime he swore he hadn't committed. He spent his days reading, writing letters, and waiting for a miracle, waiting for someone to see the truth, waiting for the state of Texas to realize they had sentenced an innocent man to die. But Texas wasn't interested in the truth. As the years passed, the courts rejected appeal after appeal. The fire evidence was never reconsidered. The jailhouse snitch's testimony was never questioned. And then, in 2004, Willingham got his execution date, February 17th. It was official now. In just a few months, he would be strapped to a gurney, a needle in his arm, and there would be nothing left to fight for, unless something changed, unless someone stopped it. And that's when, for the first time in over a decade, hope arrived. A shocking discovery. Dr. Gerald Hurst had seen it before, innocent people convicted of arson based on bad science. A chemist with a PhD from Cambridge University, he had spent years studying explosions and fire behavior, uncovering how outdated investigation techniques had ruined lives. Again and again, he watched as burn patterns were mistaken for accelerants, natural fire spread was misinterpreted as arson, and wrongful convictions were built on myth rather than science. Then, in early 2004, a case landed on his desk that felt different. A man named Cameron Todd Willingham was weeks away from execution, convicted of setting the fire that killed his children. But as Hurst pored over the case files, a chilling realization set in. Everything investigators claimed as proof of arson had already been scientifically disproven. Dr. Gerald Hurst's analysis debunked the prosecution's claims, showing that the fire's behavior was consistent with a natural flashover, not arson. Hurst's conclusion was unmistakable.
Willingham's case falls into that category where there is not one iota of evidence that the fire was arson. Not Not one iota. Taking a look at the photographs and video and testimony and fire investigation report, it became apparent that we were dealing with a fire which had gone to flashover.
Flashover, the instant ignition of all combustible material in a room.
The flashover had left natural patterns on the floor that all post-flashover fires tend to leave behind, and these had been misidentified as pour patterns, and thus the fire had been labeled an arson.
Hearst reviewed the report line by line.
All right, here's your first bit of so-called arson evidence. This was typically interpreted in the old days as a pour pattern. In other words, someone poured gasoline or some other accelerant down the hallway, out the front door, and then ignited it. The prosecutor in this case literally believed that the burn patterns on the floor were in the shape of a pentagram, like some satanic ritual. When you actually look at the burn pattern that they drew, and then you look at where the windows are, windows furnish ventilation to a fire. And all they were looking at is what we call ventilation patterns. A sample of wood debris from the base of the front porch was analyzed, and the results were positive for a combustible liquid accelerant-kerosene. Well, that's quite understandable because the porch also had a barbecue on it. And of course there would be charcoal lighter fluid there if there was a can of charcoal lighter fluid on the porch. Why were Todd Willingham's feet not burned? And the answer to that question is quite simple. Because if no accelerant was poured on the floor would have been relatively cool until shortly after flashover occurred in the bedroom. The last part of him that would have gotten any burn would have been his feet. There had to be at least one electrical short in that room. And since it was surface wiring, it would have been relative child's play to simply trace it, get a stepladder, and trace it and go over it inch by inch until you locate the fault. That in and of itself is enough to toss the case out for arson.
Hearst had come to believe Todd Willingham was not guilty.
Todd Willingham's case falls into that category where there is not one iota of evidence that the fire was arson. Not one iota.
There is not a single item of evidence that indicates arson, he wrote. The investigation was based on outdated methods and incorrect assumptions. The fire was accidental, fueled by urgency. Hearst compiled a detailed report and sent it directly to Governor Rick Perry's office, hoping someone, anyone, would stop the execution. If they didn't, Texas was about to kill an innocent man. But what happened next would expose just how broken the system truly was. The final plea for mercy. For the first time in over a decade, Cameron Todd Willingham allowed himself to believe he might actually live. Dr. Gerald Hearst's report was clear. The fire wasn't arson. The evidence that had condemned him had been misinterpreted, twisted by outdated fire science. This was the proof they had been waiting for. His attorneys acted fast, sending the findings straight to Governor Rick Perry's office, pleading for him to stop the execution and allow for a new investigation. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his clemency request without a hearing. Rick Perry ignored Hearst's report entirely. The courts refused to reconsider the case. The truth no longer mattered. The fragile hope that had carried Willingham for a few short weeks was ripped away in an instant. He wrote one final letter after receiving the news. It contained only one sentence. They do not care that I am innocent. The date was set, February 17, 2004. In 1 month, Texas was going to kill him. The execution. Morning, February 17, 2004. The morning began like any other on Texas's death row, until it didn't. Cameron Todd Willingham had seen the process unfold before. He had heard the shuffle of feet as guards approached a cell, the clinking of chains as an inmate was restrained, the rustle of fabric as the condemned was given a fresh uniform for his final moments. Now, it was his turn. At 10 a.m., the guards arrived. He had barely slept the night before. When they told him it was time, he simply nodded. There was nothing left to fight for. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, he took the final steps of his life. At 11 a.m., Willingham was transferred to the Huntsville unit, home to Texas's execution chamber. Once inside, he was placed in a holding cell just feet away from the room where he would die. He was offered a last meal: steak, 3 fried chicken thighs, a cheese omelet, fried okra, French fries, and a peanut butter bar. Outside, a small crowd had gathered: protesters, reporters, and a few people from Corsicana, some demanding justice, others questioning whether justice had been served at all. He was given the chance to make one final phone call. He declined. At 5:30 p.m., the guards came for him. The execution chamber was stark and sterile, a white room with a gurney in the center, bright lights overhead. Willingham lay down as the guards secured him in place, tightening the leather straps around his arms and legs. His breathing remained steady, his expression unreadable. Beyond the glass, witnesses had gathered, including his ex-wife, Stacy Kuykendall. She had once defended him, insisting he would never harm their children, but now she was certain of his guilt. As she looked at the man who had once been her husband, she felt no sorrow, no pity, only anger. The warden asked if he had any final words. Willingham did not apologize. He did not seek forgiveness. Instead, he locked eyes with Stacy and spoke his last words: "I hope you rot in hell, bitch." The silence in the room was suffocating. Stacy didn't flinch. She just stared back, expressionless. The warden gave the signal, and the execution began. A lethal combination of 3 drugs entered Willingham's veins. The first, sodium thiopental, sedated him, rendering him unconscious. The second, pancuronium bromide, paralyzed his muscles, ensuring he would not move or struggle. Finally, potassium chloride was administered, stopping his heart. Willingham lifted his middle finger in one final act of defiance. Then, he went still. At 6:20 p.m., Cameron Todd Willingham was pronounced dead. The room remained silent. No one spoke. No one wept. Outside, protesters held signs that read, "Texas just executed an innocent man." Inside, the state of Texas moved on. Another execution, another case closed. But the story was far from over, because in the years that followed, as investigators, scientists, and journalists re-examined the evidence, a question remained. Did Texas execute an innocent man? The case that wouldn't die. In December 2004, just months after Willingham's execution, reporters from the Chicago Tribune published an investigative piece questioning the legitimacy of the case. They had spoken with fire experts, reviewed the trial transcripts, and uncovered disturbing flaws in the forensic evidence. The article highlighted Dr. Gerald Hurst's findings, the same expert report that had been sent to Governor Rick Perry before the execution. Hurst contended that the fire was not a result of arson. The burn patterns that investigators asserted indicated the use of a liquid accelerant could be entirely accounted for by the phenomenon of flashover. Furthermore, the alleged multiple points of origin represented a frequent misinterpretation among fire investigators during that period. The media storm. The case of Cameron Todd Willingham gained widespread media attention, with multiple investigations exposing flaws in the original conviction. The Chicago Tribune was among the first to question the evidence, highlighting issues with the fire investigation. The New Yorker followed with David Grand's 2009 article Trial by Fire, which provided an in-depth analysis of how outdated forensic science and unreliable testimony led to Willingham's execution. The Texas Forensic Science Commission later reviewed the case, prompting further scrutiny. In 2011, the documentary Incendiary: The Willingham Case examined the political interference and forensic failures, bringing renewed attention to the controversy. These reports collectively raised concerns about the reliability of fire investigations and the potential for wrongful executions. The fight to save him versus the push to execute. Cameron Todd Willingham may have been alone in his cell, but beyond prison walls, a handful of people fought to stop his execution. Scientists, journalists, activists, and legal experts, strangers who had never met him but believed Texas was about to make a terrible mistake. Dr. Gerald Hurst. The fire scientist who saw the truth, a highly respected fire scientist with a PhD from Cambridge, had spent years studying fire behavior and exposing flawed arson investigations. When Willingham's attorneys reached out in 2004, desperate for someone to review the case, Hurst agreed. With only weeks left before the execution, Hurst sent his findings directly to Governor Rick Perry, urging him to review the case. But Perry ignored the report. Maurice Posley and Steve Mills, the journalists who exposed the flaws. Investigative journalists Maurice Posley and Steve Mills of the Chicago Tribune began digging into Willingham's case in 2004, months after his execution. They consulted fire experts, uncovering that the forensic evidence used to convict him was fundamentally flawed. Their findings were published in a groundbreaking investigative report, raising national doubts about Willingham's guilt. For the first time, the public began to see the cracks in the case. Elizabeth Gilbert, a Houston playwright, had no background in law or science, but after corresponding with Willingham in prison, she became convinced of his innocence. She investigated his case on her own, uncovering ignored evidence and inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument. Her findings reached David Gran of The New Yorker, who conducted a deep investigation leading to his 2009 article, Trial by Fire. His report exposed the junk science, unreliable testimony, and the state's refusal to reconsider the evidence. The Innocence Project. After Willingham's execution, the Innocence Project, a nonprofit specializing in wrongful convictions, took up his case. They petitioned the Texas Forensic Science Commission to review the fire evidence. But just 2 days before the commission's scheduled review, Governor Rick Perry replaced key members, shutting down the investigation. Texas refused to admit it had made a mistake, because for politicians, admitting to executing an innocent person is political suicide. Perry was considering a presidential run at the time. If Texas admitted that it had wrongfully put a man to death under his watch, it would raise questions about the entire death penalty system. So instead of letting the truth come out, he buried it. In the end, those who tried to save him were left with one devastating reality. They had been right, and they had been too late. The case changed everything. Willingham's case became one of the most talked about death penalty cases in modern history. His name was mentioned in debates on wrongful convictions, cited in legal studies, and used as a rallying cry for criminal justice reform. His execution sparked national discussions about the unreliable forensic science, the dangers of jailhouse informants seeking reduced sentences, a broken appeals process that ignored new evidence, and political pressure that prioritized convictions over truth. Together, these failures led to the execution of a man who may have been innocent. Years after his death, the question still lingered. Had Texas executed an innocent man? For some, the answer was clear. For others, the truth was too horrifying to admit. But one thing was undeniable. Cameron Todd Willingham's case would haunt the justice system forever. The final thoughts. Willingham's case isn't just a mistake from the past. It's a warning about the present. The flaws in his case, junk science, jailhouse informants, a broken appeals process, political interference, are still happening today. This case reminds me of a quote from Bat Masterson. We all get the same amount of ice. The rich get it in the summer, the poor get it in the winter. Justice, like ice, is supposed to be distributed evenly, but in reality, who you are, where you come from, and how much power you have can determine whether you receive fairness or cruelty. Some get second chances, better lawyers, and the benefit of the doubt. Others, like Cameron Todd Willingham, are left to face the cold with no mercy from a system that was never built to protect them. What do you think about this case? Was Cameron Todd Willingham guilty, or did Texas execute an innocent man? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, that means you found this story compelling. Maybe it made you think, maybe it made you question the justice system, or maybe it just left you shocked that something like this could happen. If you like the story, cases that dig deep, challenge what we think we know, and expose the flaws in our system, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. There are so many cases out there that deserve to be told, so many voices that need to be heard, and together, we can keep bringing them into the light. This is Liam. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.